Hey, everybody, we're going to get started. I'm just going to introduce Jill, and then she's going to take over with today's presentation. So welcome today. We're featuring Jill Krumholz from RealHr Solutions. Jill will be discussing leadership transitions and board collaboration, including how to assess organizations' need, involve the board in recruitment, and ensure a smooth leadership change. The session is being recorded, and we encourage you to ask questions in the chat. If you are not a member of the Nonprofit Resource Hub, we do invite you to join. It is free and you will gain access to a ton of valuable resources, and we'll share a link to that in the chat. So Jill, take it away.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Nonprofit Resource Hub, and welcome everyone today to Navigating Leadership Transitions. I'm very excited about doing this. I have done many webinars with Nonprofit Resource Hub. I am an associate member, and we just continue to grow our membership and add value. So I'm hoping this is of value to you today. Before I start, I'd like to actually tell you a little bit about myself, and then we'll jump right into it. So RealHr Solutions is an HR consulting and executive search firm. We provide really consulting services to both nonprofits and for-profits, probably about 70% nonprofits. We work with small to mid-sized organizations, everything from evaluating the needs of an organization when they're building HR structure to working with senior leadership on more strategy, professional development, employee development, looking at compensation, executive recruitment, and really looking at organizational culture. So it really runs the gamut. I'm pleased to be here and want to jump right into this. Please feel free as we go forward in this webinar to put your questions in chat or your comments. We very much appreciate it. We don't have a polling capability, so I'm going to ask you to put in the chat right now so I know the audience a little better. What's your role at your nonprofit? Board member, ED, or CEO, or something other? Thank you very much, everyone. Okay, so great. This is a mix of EDs, co-EDs, several board members, and VP Finance and Operations, as well as other. Okay, next question, and thank you for that, is, are you experiencing a leadership transition at the moment, or are you anticipating one? Yes, yes, both, possibly. No changes. Okay. Been going through one. It seems inevitable this will be continuous. Thank you for that. That is actually this is a really good jump off point. No, but I'm also an executive coach, so I can help, and that's great too. I'm pleased that you're on. And one last question, which I have not included here. How many of you, or let me know whether your executive director, you or your executive director are the are founders and CEOs? Anyone either on this or have a CEO that is also a founder? Recently retired. Good. Thank you very much. I think that, and the reason I ask this question is I think that we find different issues, different concerns, even greater complications when we're talking about CEO founders and trying to replace CEO founders. So as challenging as it always is to replace senior leadership, there's another layer, as you all know, with a founding director, as you can imagine. So to jump into our agenda, we will discuss navigating leadership transition and really what that means and the impact of it on organizations. When we're navigating transition, addressing organizational needs, collaborating with the board, transitioning between leaders, and then we'll do a Q&A in the chat, and then a summary and closing comments. What I want to share with you, and I think Kelly mentioned it, we will have this available to you We'll have the audio available to you and also a PDF of this presentation on Monday, as well as we'll have 2 articles for you, follow-up articles that I think that hopefully you'll find helpful. Okay, so let's dive in. So navigating leadership transition, I think the first thing is determining who and what is needed to lead this transition. Gaining commitment from the board, staff, and others, and identifying some of the challenges associated with the solutions. And I think as many of us have experienced, navigating a leadership transition is extremely challenging. It's a long process. And often there is not the bandwidth or the timeline to make the kinds of plans we'd like to make. And certainly the most challenging of transition changes is when someone leaves abruptly and there is not the opportunity for planning. But let's talk about this, and specifically, let's talk about planning, addressing organizational needs, both the strategic and succession plans of an organization, identifying the organizational direction, and really identifying the organizational strengths and gaps. So if we look at organizations that are making transitions, some of the things that we look at are, one, whether there is a strategic plan in place, and then also if there is a succession plan. And I think that with a strategic plan, if there is not a plan in place, when there's a transition is not the time to put something in place. But if in fact there is a strategic plan, then you have the luxury, and it's a more recent strategic plan, you have the luxury of utilizing that plan as really a roadmap for yourselves, either on the board or the current ED, if they're involved in the change that's happening, or other senior leaders. So a strategic plan can be extremely helpful if it is fairly current, and if you're using that as a guide and really your North Star for the hiring you're going to do in terms of a leader. Succession planning is a luxury, and we all know that. Generally, in the nonprofit world, we don't have the money to have a number 2 that is going to walk, right in. If you have that, that's a tremendous luxury and a great plus if there is a number 2 that is being groomed for that number 1 position. But in terms of succession plans, most of us don't have the luxury of doing that. And again, whether it is because of finances, whether it's because we were not planning on it and someone left abruptly, or we asked them to leave, succession plans are tough. If instead of a succession plan, you can do some kinds of operational planning, kind of succession plan light, an organization really does much better if they have some plans in place. Identifying organizational direction. I think this goes back to one, what is a strategic plan? What is the board looking at and the current ED or CEO in terms of where is the organization currently and where is the organization going? I think transitions are a great opportunity. They're painful. They can be painstakingly long in terms of identifying the right next leader. But they are an opportunity. So where is the strategic plan? What is the focus? What still needs to be done? And that really is your North Star for really reflecting the org direction and then looking at the organization and their strengths and gaps. Please feel free, by the way, to put some thoughts, questions in the chat while I am speaking. So importance of planning, the benefit of a strategic plan, planning for succession where you can, as I mentioned, identifying the direction of the organization. It's really a tremendous opportunity to look at what the future is for the organization and plan for that future. Defining the new leader. One of the things that we see is certainly that the board of directors has responsibility for overseeing the executive director. They also have responsibility for supporting the EG and the organization in terms of where the organization is going, what the strategy is. So looking at the partnership between the board and the current executive director, right, and where their strengths are and where their gaps are, hopefully, as you're growing your board, and we're not going to get into the interesting and the intricacies of boards and the makeup of boards, but hoping that your board adds great value and has various strengths, whether it be finance, well, it should be finance, and certainly communications and development and so forth. You really want to assess the strengths on your board and really what your senior leader needs to be going forward. So determining based on the board and their expertise, really where is the focus? Is the focus more on an operational executive director? Is it really fundraising and development? Is it, as part of fundraising and development, is it really very much community focused? Is it, working with politicians and securing grants? So defining what the next leader will be and how you bring the organization, how you as the board members, you as senior leaders, and hopefully some of the senior leaders, the VP of operations that I know is participating here, will have input into what this looks like, right? So if there is a very, very strong development person in your organization, although, nonprofits obviously always need very strong development people, so the executive director needs to have that as well. But if there is great, bench strength in your board and also with a development person at a senior level, perhaps there's another need that you have. So it really is assessing what your needs are for your particular organization at the particular time that you're experiencing this. Again, I keep saying, and I like to say this relative to transitions, to search, to HR and building HR capability for an organization. Sometimes it is painful, but it's great opportunity. We want to step back a little bit and really recognize that, and I've done a lot of reading from the Center for Effective Philanthropy and Board Source, and I'm sure many of you have, referenced those. The burnout from post-COVID, change in economy, turnover, shortage of employees has created an enormous amount of burnout for employees and certainly for executive directors overall. And so the Center for Effective Philanthropy talks about at least 1/3 of executive directors and maybe even more of nonprofits that are looking for their next opportunity. There certainly is also the baby boomers who have been executive directors who possibly have extended their stay and are deciding now to consider leaving. So it's for all those reasons. So if we jump into collaborating with the board and how important that is and how the board really helps to navigate this situation, hopefully the board and the current ED, if all things are aligned, have the ability to collaborate as they're moving forward. If the ED is no longer in place, then it really is the board, a committee that's a search committee, as well as bringing in the other stakeholders, being the leaders of other leaders within the organization, the senior staff, and really getting feedback from everyone in the organization. And also the communication amongst all of these stakeholders is certainly critical. Even your fundraisers. So, really looking at what your board will be doing, their engagement, engaging the entire organization, and starting to look at how you're going to recruit for the position. What is the search process? What is the search methodology? Looking in the chat to see if anyone has comments at all. Best practices for board engagement around transition. It really relies on effective communication, really clear delineation of what people are doing, what the roles of each of the board members are, the importance of transparency and trust. I'm going to give a little bit of an example. We're working with a global organization that was transitioning out their CEO, nonprofit transitioning out the CEO. And it was a small organization. Everybody was very hands-on, very involved, and the board was not communicating with the employees in terms of what was going on. So it was many, many months of looking for a new executive director, but the board had really not put in place a mechanism they had a mechanism for recruiting. They didn't have a mechanism for communication. So there was not transparency. There was not trust. And again, a very small org, but they wound up losing people. And that was very, very painful during a difficult time to begin with. So transparency and trust is so critical. I'm going to just stop for a second. Mary DeRosa, thank you. The biggest mistake I've ever seen is not engaging senior team in the process of transitions. Boards don't think of that. Painful. It's a really painful thing. Second mistake is having a succession plan with the wrong interim or secondary leader. CEO leaves, but they name an education director as a successor. So preparation is a tremendous challenge when you're doing a transition. Again, preparing, communication. You lose staff during that period. This is a difficult time to lose more staff. Turnover is tremendous. One of the things that certainly we look at, and I'm sure all of you think about, is agreeing on what you're going to do in the interim if the ED is not remaining. So who is best suited, back to Mary's comment, who is best suited to step up if there is no succession plan, if there is not anyone who is next in line? One, is there an opportunity? Is someone internally going to be considered as a candidate? Very often you find it, and if you're using an external search firm, for instance, the internal person, the candidate, becomes part of that candidate pool, so that there is, an unbiased search person or another consultant type person who is looking at your internal folks as well as the external candidate pool. Another thing that I think I've seen a lot of, and there are pros and cons, but there are interim ED folks who are more than interested and have become very familiar with taking on that role. And so while that's not appropriate for all organizations, and it may not fit your culture, or it may be so intricate that an interim would not work, but consider that an interim could be a potential alternative. The other alternative is to have the board working with really a firm, a consulting firm that specializes in these transitions. So you may, in fact, have the support of them. All right. Generally, they're strategic. They're not necessarily operational, but they could potentially be a bridge. So where do you really find that bridge? Is it is it a board member who can step in? And want to highlight that the relationship that the board has with your team, with your employees, pre this will make a tremendous, tremendous difference in what happens during this period of time. So I think we all have found that there are board members that really don't know they're the employees and they're removed from that. If you can look at the relationship with your board and do a better job of building those relationships during a transition period, it is really much more collaborative. And there are boards that are great with the team, with employees. They're, committee members, they're leads of committees, and they have strong relationships within the organization. But that really is critical to any organization as they're moving forward. So determining search methodology, are your board members going to do themselves, do this search themselves? I have worked with some small organizations that have spoken with my firm about doing the search, and they've decided to try it on their own. And, I always say, feel free to, I hope it works for you. And sometimes they have such a huge network that it does. In other instances, the search methodology may be a search firm. Other comments at the moment? I'm just looking, I want to respond to other thoughts. Transitioning between, anyone have comments before we move on in terms of the transition of leaders? Anyone have comments regarding the involvement of the board, the relationships between the board and senior staff? Again, I want to focus on senior staff, or, they're really important in this process, and board members really need to bring them into the fold, as well as the rest of the team. Any comments in terms of board communication, relationships, search committees amongst boards, really important thing. 10 people on a board cannot lead a search. Hopefully there will be a smaller search committee, and then that search committee is doing the interface with the external consultant or search professional, and then is going back to the larger board when they're closer to narrowing down the candidate pool. Other thoughts? Okay. I'm looking at the time. Just want to make sure we have time for thoughts and questions. Transitioning between leaders, the importance of a smooth transition, the key stakeholders in the process, strategies for ensuring continuity. Want to also make a comment in terms of key stakeholders. Your donors, where you do your fundraising, those relationships you have as board members or as senior leaders is really critical, and they are really part of your stakeholders. And so consider that. The transition of a leader is so critical. So, I've spent all this time and money in identifying the right candidate, and really having the proper spec in terms of who the right candidates are. And 50% of this is really getting it right in terms of the onboarding process. If you have the luxury of having the prior ED, the incumbent, to work with that leader, and if it is right for your organization, it's not right for all organizations, but if it's right for your organization, then that's terrific. Board members specific board members may be involved in the onboarding, as well as the senior leaders on the team. So the importance of that smooth transition is just, it can't be stressed enough. What are the strategies for ensuring that continuity? How is that communication happening? How is the transfer of information happening? All of these things are extremely critical. What is the transition and what's the impact on the remainder of the organization? And again, the board really needs to focus on that. And sometimes it's just not on their radar. They don't have the bandwidth. They have other things that they're doing. They're interviewing candidates. Really important to bring the organization in and maintain stability. And again, sometimes the interim situation is good for maintaining stability. Sometimes it could be a negative. It really depends on looking at your organization and looking at your culture. Okay, again, identifying the key stakeholders in the transition, strategies for ensuring continuity, identifying methods for organizational momentum. What is going to keep the organization going? What kind of developmental things where can a VP of ops, finance and ops, take on some of the things that the ED had. How can you then help for this transition for the new ED coming in to take over that responsibility? So the more people you have of senior level and of the board that can be involved in this, and again, it's all really specific to your culture. So we're getting towards the end, and I'm just again looking at time. I'm wondering if there are comments, questions. Please feel free. We'd love to hear from you in terms of experiences you've had. Wish I could hear your voices. Questions for me. Question, what are the biggest math mistakes you've seen? Again, I think that it is preparation or lack of preparation. Even if you're not suspecting that your ED will be leaving, if you can do some amount of preparing, if you're building your bench strength internally. And I think the other thing that really is extremely big is the board understanding that their focus is not just on the hiring, but it's the continuity and the communication with the organization. And if your organization's very large, then certainly there are point people, and it may be your senior leaders, but it may be the board visiting the organization, sending out, having town halls during this process. It can take months and months and months, as we all know, to find the right director. I think the other mistake is getting tired of the process and potentially not hiring the right leader for where you want to take your organization. So anyone, actually, I'm going to ask you, because I haven't seen it recently, statistics of turnover with new EDs. That's certainly a concern. Question came in, how do you determine who on the board should be in the search process? How do you make sure it's the right people? How does the board determine the right people or person to fill the role? So I'll break that down a little bit. So how do you determine who on the board should be part of the search process? Sometimes people volunteer, and that's great. I think there should be diversity of thought, diversity in terms of what people bring, in terms of the color of their skin, their age, their gender. You want to represent your organization, and you really want to get different views. You want to have people on this committee that perhaps have some great institutional knowledge, but also people who have different views, are not necessarily as entrenched in the organization, and can bring a different lens to it. So I think that's really critical. I would suggest in general, and of course it depends upon the size of your organization, but I think probably 5 people on a search committee is a good amount of people. 7 is an okay amount of people, and it gets beyond that, it gets very difficult. Um, there should be someone on who is assessing the financial capabilities of the potential candidates. There should be a development person on, and really the functional areas that are key to your hire. And so I think that there's not necessarily the same across the board for all organizations. It really depends what your organization is looking for. I'm a new ED. Any tips for must-dos in the first few weeks? Thank you, Judy. Must-dos in the first few weeks, I think, are really spending time, well, really spending time with the board. You've spent a lot of time with the board as you've been, and with the search committee, as you have been interviewing. It's really, I think, now a matter of sitting down with the board and figuring out how the strategies you discussed can be executed, and what does the first 30, 60, 90 days, what does the first 6 months look like? What does success look like? So the board interaction is enormously important, Judy. And the other piece is really getting to know your team and your employees, not just your senior team, but other employees, other advocates within the organization, sitting down with people who are having a hard time, learning from them. It's really a balance. It's learning, it's doing due diligence as you are getting to know the organization, but it's also having credibility and having a presence as that new leader. And also you and the board really talking to the organization about what the new vision is, because vision generally changes, based on what the strategic plan may have been, based on what the future looks like. And you really, I think, with the board or without the board, want to hold some meetings and some town halls. And again, it really depends upon your culture. Other questions? How does the board and staff work together to onboard new ED? We're just talking about that. Should there be ED overlap if possible? There's no right answer. I think that it depends upon the reason the ED is leaving. In many instances, if there's been a great relationship and that ED is generous with their time and willing, and the board feels that it'll be constructive, it can be a great situation. It also depends upon the comfort of the new person you're bringing in. So, in a lot of these situations, things need to be aligned, but things need to be, clearly asked, communicated, and so forth. But where you can have that transition, it can be extremely helpful. In other situations, it can be, it can really be destructive. So it depends upon what the relationship has been, and also depends upon where the organization is going and how different, the direction is from the current ED. So there's institutional knowledge, but there is also the balance of looking into the future, not so much the past. I don't see any other questions. Would love to chat with you more. There's lots to say about this. Please feel free to reach out to me. Again, I hope this has been helpful, productive. And again, there's so much to say that we're really just scratching the surface in a lot of ways. I thank you for joining. I hope you will look for our recording of this. We will send you this in a PDF, and I will also follow up with some really 2 very interesting articles for you. So thank you. And thank you, Kelly and Nonprofit Resource Hub, for having me.
Thank you, Jill. It was great. And thank you for everybody who's attended today. Like Jill said, everything will be going out on Monday to you. So keep an eye out for that. And in addition, I just wanted to let everybody know that we do have a webinar on October 10th with Ed Probst from Vanguard Benefits, where he'll be discussing designing an impactful corporate wellness plan for nonprofit success. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And we will talk to you soon.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Jill.
Thank you.